If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1. The Spark in the Desert, Prophet Muhammad and the Birth of Islam. Part 1. A World on the Brink. Arabia, before Revelation. In the vast Arabian Peninsula of the late 6th century, a world teetered on the edge of transformation. The sandy expanse between the Byzantine and Persian empires had become a crossroads of cultures, yet remained fragmented and restless. This was a land where survival depended on knowing your place in an intricate web of tribal loyalties and ancient customs. Mecca stood as the beating heart of this desert world. Caravans loaded with silk, spices, and precious stones wound through its dusty streets, connecting distant lands from Yemen to Syria. The city's merchants had grown wealthy from these trade routes, but this prosperity came with a heavy price. A sharp divide split Meccan society between the powerful trading families and the struggling masses who barely scraped by. The Quraysh tribe controlled the city with an iron grip. These merchant princes owned the caravans, collected the taxes, and made the decisions that affected everyone else. They lived in comfortable stone houses, while others crowded into simple mud brick dwellings. The wealthy adorned themselves with fine clothes and jewelry, while the poor wore rough woolen garments and wondered where their next meal would come from. Religion in Mecca centered around the Kaaba, a cube-shaped shrine that housed hundreds of stone and wooden idols. Pilgrims traveled from across Arabia to worship these gods and goddesses, bringing coins that filled Quraysh coffers. Each tribe had its favorite deities, and the pantheon grew larger with every passing year. People believed these gods controlled rain, war, fertility, and fortune, so they offered sacrifices and prayers hoping for divine favor. Yet beneath this religious facade, moral decay spread like rot in a date palm. The wealthy exploited the poor without shame. Female infants were often buried alive because families considered them burdens. Slavery flourished in the markets alongside other goods. Tribal raids and blood feuds consumed generations in cycles of revenge that seemed endless. Many Arabs felt lost in this world of competing loyalties and hollow rituals. They performed their religious duties, but found little comfort in stone idols that neither spoke nor moved. Some searched for deeper meaning, retreating to caves in the surrounding mountains to meditate and pray. These seekers, called Hanifs, rejected idol worship and sought the one true God they believed their ancestor Abraham had known. The tribal system that had once provided protection now created constant tension. Loyalty to clan trumped every other consideration, making unity impossible. When disputes arose, they were settled by force or lengthy negotiations between tribal elders. Justice depended on your family's strength rather than moral principles. Into this fractured world of spiritual hunger and social turmoil, a child named Muhammad was born around 570 CE. He entered a society ready for change but resistant to it, wealthy yet morally bankrupt, religiously active yet spiritually empty. The stage was set for a revelation that would challenge everything these desert dwellers held sacred. Part 2. The Night of Power, First Revelation in the Cave, 610 CE. Muhammad had always been different from other men in Mecca, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened in that cave. At 40 years old, he had built a reputation as a trustworthy merchant and thoughtful man who often retreated to Mount Hira to think and pray. The cave was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise and corruption of city life below. On this particular night, in the year 610, Muhammad sat alone in the darkness as he had countless times before. The silence felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Suddenly, the cave filled with a presence so overwhelming that every fiber of his being trembled. A figure appeared before him, magnificent and terrifying, radiating light that seemed to burn through his very soul. The voice that spoke was unlike anything human. It commanded him with a single word that would echo through history: read. Muhammad, who had never learned to read or write, stammered back in confusion and fear. "I cannot read," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. The figure pressed closer, and Muhammad felt as though he was being squeezed until all breath left his body. Again came the command, "Read," and again Muhammad protested his inability. The crushing sensation returned, more intense than before, as if his chest would collapse under the weight of this divine presence. The third time the command came, it was followed by words that would become the first verses of the Quran. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. The words poured into Muhammad's mind with crystal clarity, each syllable burning itself into his memory. The figure identified himself as Gabriel, the angel of God, and the message was unmistakable. Muhammad had been chosen to be God's messenger to his people. The cave seemed to spin around him as the full weight of this revelation crashed down upon his shoulders. When the vision ended, Muhammad stumbled out of the cave, his body shaking uncontrollably. Was he losing his mind? Had evil spirits possessed him? The people of Mecca would surely think him mad if he spoke of this experience. He rushed down the mountain toward home, glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following him through the desert night. His wife Khadijah found him wrapped in blankets, trembling and sweating despite the cool evening air. When he finally found the courage to tell her what had happened, she listened without judgment or mockery. Her response would prove crucial to the birth of Islam. She believed him completely. She reminded him of his good character, his kindness to the poor, and his honesty in all dealings. God would not humiliate a man like you, she assured him. This moment in the cave changed everything. The message Muhammad received challenged the very foundation of Arabian society. It proclaimed that there was only one God, not the hundreds of idols housed in the Kaaba. It demanded justice for the poor and oppressed, threatening the wealth and power of Mecca's elite. It called for moral behavior in a society where might made right. Muhammad emerged from that cave carrying a message that would transform not just Arabia, but the entire world. The frightened man who had trembled before Gabriel's presence was now tasked with confronting the most powerful forces in his society. The revelation had planted a seed that would grow into a movement capable of shaking empires. Part 3. Secret Gatherings and Early Converts. Faith in the Shadow of Danger. Muhammad knew the message burning in his heart would shake Mecca to its foundations. But spreading it openly would mean certain death. The Quraysh controlled everything in the city, from the sacred Kaaba to the profitable trade routes. They would never tolerate someone challenging their power and profits. So he began quietly, like planting seeds in hidden gardens. Muhammad first approached those closest to him. His wife Khadijah believed immediately, her wealth and status providing crucial protection. His young cousin Ali, barely 10 years old, accepted without question. Abu Bakr, his trusted friend and successful merchant, became the first adult male convert outside the family. These early believers faced an impossible choice. Accepting Muhammad's message meant rejecting everything their society held sacred. It meant turning their backs on the gods their fathers worshipped. It meant standing against the most powerful families in Arabia. Word began spreading through whispered conversations in homes and quiet corners of the marketplace. A freed slave named Bilal joined them, despite knowing his conversion could cost him everything. Young men from lesser tribes saw hope in a message that promised equality before God. Women found dignity in teachings that protected their rights. The new believers gathered in secret at a house belonging to a convert named Al-Arqam. Hidden from prying eyes, they prayed together and listened to Muhammad recite the verses that continued flowing through him. These meetings required careful planning. Too many people arriving at once would attract attention. The wrong person overhearing could mean disaster. Muhammad's message struck at the heart of Meccan society. He preached that all people were equal before God, whether they were wealthy merchants or powerless slaves. He condemned the practice of burying baby girls alive. He demanded fair treatment for orphans and widows. He called for sharing wealth with the poor instead of hoarding it. The Quraysh watched this growing movement with increasing alarm. Their power rested on the old ways, the old gods, the old inequalities. If people believed they were all equal, who would serve the wealthy? If they worshipped only one god, who would visit the profitable shrines? If they demanded justice, how could the powerful exploit the weak? Opposition started small but grew fiercer. Converts faced social isolation as former friends turned away. Business partnerships dissolved. Families disowned their own children. Some believers endured physical beatings from angry relatives. Yet the movement continued growing. Each new convert brought others. The promise of divine justice appealed to those society had forgotten. The certainty of life after death comforted those suffering in this world. The idea of direct connection with God, without priests or intermediaries, attracted thoughtful minds. Muhammad walked a dangerous tightrope during these early years. He needed to protect his followers while spreading the message that demanded to be heard. Every day brought new risks as the community slowly expanded, building strength for the greater trials that lay ahead. Part 4. Persecution and the First Exodus. Abyssinia beckons. The situation in Mecca had grown dangerous. What began as whispered threats now turned into open violence. Wealthy merchants who controlled the city's trade saw Muhammad's teachings as a direct attack on their way of life. They owned slaves, charged interest on loans, and worshipped gods that brought them profit. Muhammad's message of equality and justice threatened everything they valued. The persecution started with insults and mockery. Then it escalated. Muslim slaves faced brutal beatings from their masters. Free believers lost their jobs and businesses. Families turned against their own members who had accepted the new faith. The powerful Quraysh tribe organized boycotts, refusing to trade with anyone who supported Muhammad. They wanted to starve the movement into submission. Some Muslims endured torture that would break ordinary people. Bilal, an African slave, was dragged into the desert heat with heavy rocks placed on his chest. His master demanded he renounce his faith. Despite the agony, Bilal kept repeating one, refusing to abandon his belief in the single God. Stories like his spread through the community, inspiring others, but also revealing the terrible price of following Muhammad. The Prophet watched his followers suffer and made a difficult decision. He could not protect them all in Mecca. The solution came from an unexpected source. Across the Red Sea lay the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia, ruled by a just king known for protecting the oppressed. Muhammad chose a group of his most vulnerable followers and told them to flee to this distant land. The first migration included about 80 people. They left quietly in small groups to avoid detection. Women carried babies, men brought few possessions. They had no guarantee of safety or welcome, only faith that their prophet's guidance would lead them to protection. The journey itself was dangerous, crossing hostile territory, then sailing across treacherous waters to reach an unknown land. King Najashi of Abyssinia received the Muslim refugees with curiosity. The Quraysh sent representatives demanding their return, claiming these people were dangerous rebels. But when the king asked the Muslims to explain their faith, their spokesman delivered words that changed everything. He described Jesus and Mary in terms the Christian king recognized and respected. The Muslims believed in the same God, honored the same prophets, and sought the same moral life. The king granted them asylum. For the first time since becoming Muslims, these believers could pray openly, raise their children in the faith, and live without fear. The exile created bonds between Muslims that would last lifetimes. They had sacrificed their homeland for their beliefs and survived together in a foreign land. This first exodus proved that Islam could travel beyond Arabia's borders and find acceptance among other people of faith. It also showed Muhammad's followers that their commitment was absolute. They would leave everything behind rather than abandon their beliefs. The success of this migration would soon inspire an even greater journey that would change the course of history. Part 5. Loss and Loss Again. Death of Khadija and Abu Talib. The year that would be remembered as the Year of Sorrow began with crushing weight. Muhammad had weathered years of opposition, drawing strength from two pillars that had supported him through every trial. His wife Khadija, the woman who had believed in him before anyone else, and his uncle Abu Talib, the man whose protection had kept the wolves of Mecca at bay. In a span of months, both would be taken from him. Khadija had been more than a wife. She was his first convert, his business partner, and his closest confidant. When others mocked his claims of divine revelation, she stood firm in her belief. When the boycotts drained their wealth, she never complained. Her presence had been a safe harbor in the storm of persecution that surrounded their growing faith. But 15 years of marriage could not shield her from mortality and illness, slowly claimed the woman who had given everything for Islam's birth. Her death shattered Muhammad in ways that few could understand. The woman who had held his trembling hands after his first terrifying encounter with the angel Gabriel was gone. The house that had once buzzed with quiet conversations about faith and strategy fell silent. Khadijah had not merely supported the message, she had shaped how it spread through her wisdom and resources. Without her steady presence, Muhammad faced a loneliness that cut deeper than any external persecution. Before grief could fully settle, another blow struck. Abu Talib, Muhammad's uncle and protector, lay dying. For decades, this powerful man had used his influence within the Hashim clan to shield his nephew from the worst intentions of Mecca's elite. The Quraysh leaders had wanted to silence Muhammad permanently, but Abu Talib's protection made direct violence impossible. They could boycott, mock, and threaten, but they could not simply eliminate the prophet while Abu Talib lived. Muhammad begged his uncle to convert before death, to embrace the faith he had protected for so long. But Abu Talib, though he loved his nephew, could not abandon the religion of his fathers. He died as he had lived, loyal to Muhammad the man, but not to Muhammad the prophet. This personal tragedy carried political disaster. With Abu Talib gone, the thin shield protecting Muhammad crumbled. The Quraysh sensed their opportunity immediately. The man they had wanted to destroy for years now stood alone, without the two people who had made his survival possible. Threats that had once been whispered became open declarations. Physical attacks that had been restrained became bold and brutal. Muhammad found stones thrown at his feet during prayer, thorns scattered in his path, and hostile crowds gathering wherever he went. The Muslim community watched their leader struggle with grief while facing unprecedented danger. The safe spaces that had allowed Islam to grow quietly began disappearing. Believers who had found courage in Muhammad's protected status now wondered if their faith would cost them their lives. The movement that had survived through secret meetings and careful alliances suddenly faced the prospect of complete destruction. This double catastrophe forced Muhammad to confront a harsh reality. The gradual approach that had worked for over a decade would no longer suffice. Something dramatic had to change, or Islam might die with its founder in the hostile streets of Mecca. Chapter 2. Rise from Exile, the Hijra and the Making of Medina. Part 1. The Hijra, a midnight flight to Medina, 622 CE. The flickering oil lamps of Mecca cast long shadows on the walls as the Quraysh elders gathered in their council chamber. Their voices carried a deadly urgency that cut through the desert night air. Abu Jahl's eyes burned with hatred as he spoke the words that would change history forever. "Muhammad has gone too far," he declared, his fist striking the wooden table. "His followers grow bolder each day. Soon they will challenge our very authority." The plan they hatched was simple and brutal. Representatives from each major tribe would surround Muhammad's house at dawn. When he emerged for morning prayers, they would strike together. No single tribe could be blamed for his death. The blood guilt would be shared, making revenge impossible for his small band of followers. Meanwhile, across the city, divine revelation reached Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. The message was clear and urgent. "They plot against you. Leave this place tonight." The prophet's heart raced as he understood the gravity of his situation. Death waited at his doorstep, but God had provided a path to safety. Muhammad moved swiftly through the darkness to reach Abu Bakr's house. His closest companion had already prepared for this moment, gathering supplies and arranging for guides. The two men embraced, knowing they might never see their birthplace again. As they slipped through Mecca's sleeping streets, every shadow seemed to hide an enemy. The assassins arrived at Muhammad's house before sunrise, weapons gleaming in the early light. They waited patiently as the sun climbed higher, expecting their target to emerge. When they finally forced their way inside, they found only Ali, Muhammad's young cousin, sleeping peacefully in the prophet's bed. Their prey had vanished like smoke in the wind. Muhammad and Abu Bakr had taken refuge in a cave on Mount Thor, just south of Mecca. For 3 days they remained hidden while search parties scoured the countryside. Spiders wove webs across the cave entrance, and birds built nests nearby. When the hunters arrived, they saw these natural barriers and assumed the cave was empty. Divine protection had taken the form of simple creatures. After the search parties gave up, the two men began their dangerous journey north toward Yathrib, later known as Medina. The desert stretched endlessly before them, filled with scorching heat by day and bitter cold by night. Their guide led them along forgotten paths, avoiding the main roads where bounty hunters waited. The people of Medina had been expecting Muhammad for months. Representatives from their warring tribes had met him in Mecca the previous year, begging him to come and bring peace to their troubled city. They needed someone above tribal politics, someone who could unite their divided communities under a common cause. When Muhammad finally appeared on the horizon, riding his camel Qaswa, the entire city erupted in celebration. Children ran alongside his mount, singing songs of welcome. Women threw flower petals from their rooftops. The date was September 24th, 622 CE, a moment so significant that it would later mark the beginning of the Islamic calendar. This migration, known as the Hijra, transformed Muhammad from a persecuted preacher into a political leader. In Medina, he would no longer simply call people to faith. He would build a community, establish laws, and lay the foundation for what would become one of history's most influential civilizations. Part 2. Founding a new community, the Constitution of Medina. The cheers and flower petals had barely settled when Muhammad faced his greatest challenge yet. Medina wasn't just another city welcoming a religious teacher. It was a powder keg of competing tribes, ancient feuds, and religious differences that had torn the community apart for generations. The Aus and Khazraj tribes had been locked in bitter warfare for decades. Jewish clans controlled much of the city's wealth and trade. Smaller groups of pagans and early Muslims added to the complex mix. How could one man unite such a fractured society? Muhammad understood that good intentions and spiritual messages wouldn't be enough. He needed something revolutionary. Within months of his arrival, he began drafting what would become known as the Constitution of Medina. This wasn't just another tribal agreement or religious decree. It was something the world had never seen before. The document he created broke every rule of Arabian society. For centuries, loyalty meant blood. You belonged to your tribe, your clan, your family, period. But Muhammad's constitution introduced a radical new idea. People could belong to something bigger than blood relations. They could join an ummah, a community bound together by shared beliefs and mutual responsibility, rather than family ties. The Constitution spelled out exactly how this would work. Muslims, Jews, and pagan tribes would all have protection under the new system. Each group could keep their own religious practices. No one would be forced to convert, but everyone would share certain responsibilities. If Medina was attacked, all groups would fight together. If someone committed a crime, the community would handle justice fairly. If disputes arose between different groups, Muhammad would serve as the final judge. Jewish leaders like those from the Banu Nadir and Banu Kainuka clans found themselves in an unprecedented position. They could maintain their faith and traditions while gaining protection and political representation. Many were skeptical but recognized the practical benefits. The endless cycle of tribal revenge killings might finally end. The Aus and Khazraj tribal chiefs faced an even bigger adjustment. Their ancient hatreds had defined their identities for generations. Now they were being asked to see former enemies as brothers in a new community. Some embraced the change eagerly, tired of constant warfare. Others grumbled but went along, recognizing Muhammad's growing influence. Muhammad's genius lay in the details. The Constitution didn't just proclaim unity. It created practical mechanisms to make it work. Specific procedures for handling disputes, clear rules about who owed what to whom, detailed descriptions of how different groups would contribute to common defense. These weren't abstract principles, but concrete guidelines for daily life. The document established Muhammad not just as a spiritual guide, but as a political leader with real authority. He could settle disputes, organize military campaigns, and make binding decisions for the entire community. This dual role would become the template for Islamic leadership for centuries to come. As word of the Constitution spread throughout Medina, something remarkable began to happen. The constant tension that had poisoned the city for decades started to ease. People began to see possibilities beyond the endless cycle of tribal conflict that had trapped them for so long. Part 3. faith, law, and power, building the first Islamic state. With the constitution in place, Muhammad faced the enormous task of transforming written agreements into living reality. The document was one thing, but governing a diverse city filled with Muslims, Jews, Christians, and various tribal groups required daily decisions that would test every principle he had outlined. The first challenge came from within his own followers. The Muslims who had fled Mecca arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Meanwhile, the local Muslims of Medina had homes, farms, and established businesses. Muhammad created a revolutionary solution called the Brotherhood system. He paired each refugee with a local supporter, creating bonds that went beyond charity. These partnerships meant sharing wealth, homes, and even inheritance rights. Some locals grumbled about supporting strangers, but Muhammad made it clear that this generosity was not optional. It was a religious duty. Women's rights became another testing ground for his authority. In a society where women were often treated as property, Muhammad introduced reforms that shocked many traditionalists. He limited the number of wives a man could have to 4, but only if he could treat them equally. He gave women the right to own property, conduct business, and even divorce their husbands under certain conditions. When some men complained that these rules went too far, Muhammad stood firm. He claimed these changes came directly from God, making opposition tantamount to rebellion against divine will. The treatment of orphans revealed Muhammad's approach to social justice. In pre-Islamic Arabia, orphan children often faced exploitation or abandonment. Muhammad, himself an orphan, made their protection a central concern. He established laws requiring proper care for orphan children and harsh penalties for those who stole from their inheritance. He personally oversaw cases where orphans had been mistreated, sending a clear message that the powerful could not prey on the vulnerable. Religious disputes proved particularly delicate. When conflicts arose between Muslims and Jewish tribes over religious practices or business dealings, Muhammad had to balance his role as protector of all citizens with his identity as a prophet. He often consulted with Jewish leaders and scholars, showing respect for their traditions while maintaining that Islam offered a newer revelation. This careful diplomacy kept the peace, but created ongoing tension about where religious authority truly lay. Tax collection became another source of authority. Muhammad instituted a system called zakat, requiring Muslims to give a portion of their wealth to support the poor and fund community projects. Unlike the arbitrary tributes demanded by traditional tribal leaders, this system had fixed rates and clear purposes. Non-Muslims paid a different tax called jizya in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. These steady revenues allowed Muhammad to fund public works and military operations without constantly demanding contributions. As months passed, people began to see results. Streets became safer as the new laws took effect. The poor received regular support through the zakat system. Disputes that once led to blood feuds were now settled through mediation. Muhammad's combination of spiritual authority and practical governance was creating something unprecedented in Arabian society, a state that served both earthly and divine purposes, setting the stage for conflicts that would determine whether this bold experiment could survive. Part 4. Sword and Shield. Clashes with Mecca. The peace Muhammad had carefully built in Medina could not last. News traveled fast across the desert, and the Quraysh merchants of Mecca watched with growing alarm as their former outcast gained power. What had started as a minor religious dispute was becoming a serious threat to their way of life. The first blow came not through direct warfare, but through economics. Muhammad authorized raids on Meccan trade caravans passing through the desert routes. These weren't random attacks, but calculated strikes designed to hurt Mecca where it mattered most, their wealth. The Muslim raiders, mostly emigrants who had lost everything when they fled Mecca, saw this as both survival and justice. At a place called Badr in 624 CE, a small force of 300 Muslims faced nearly 1,000 Meccan warriors. The odds seemed impossible, but something extraordinary happened. The disciplined Muslim fighters, motivated by both faith and desperation, routed the larger army. Key Meccan leaders died in the battle, including Abu Jahl, one of Muhammad's fiercest opponents. Victory at Badr sent shockwaves throughout Arabia. Tribes that had been watching from the sidelines suddenly took notice. Here was a new power that could defeat the mighty Quraysh. But success brought new challenges. The Meccans couldn't let this insult stand, and they began planning their revenge. The following year brought a massive retaliation. At Uhud, just outside Medina, the Meccans arrived with 3,000 fighters, including cavalry and archers. This time, they were prepared for Muslim tactics. The battle started well for the Muslims, but when some fighters broke formation to collect spoils, the Meccan cavalry struck back hard. Muhammad himself was wounded, and rumors spread that he had been killed. Though not a complete defeat, Uhud shattered the myth of Muslim invincibility. Some tribes that had been considering joining Muhammad now hesitated. The Jewish tribes of Medina, who had been uneasy allies, began to question whether they had backed the right side. The psychological impact ran deeper than casualties. In Mecca, confidence returned. The Quraysh began building a grand coalition, reaching out to every tribe with grievances against Muhammad. They promised wealth, revenge, and a return to the old ways. By 627 CE, this massive alliance was ready. 10,000 fighters surrounded Medina in what became known as the Battle of the Trench. Muhammad, drawing on Persian military knowledge, ordered the digging of a defensive trench around the city's exposed areas. For weeks, the coalition laid siege, but they couldn't breach the defenses. Cold, hunger, and internal disputes gradually weakened the alliance. When fierce winds battered their camps, the coalition finally broke apart and retreated. The failed siege marked a turning point. The Meccans had thrown everything at Medina and failed. Their aura of invincibility was gone, and Muhammad emerged stronger than ever, ready to take the initiative. Part 5. The Expanding Community, Diplomacy, Marriage, and Conversion. After the failed siege, Muhammad recognized that military victories alone wouldn't secure Islam's future. The time had come for a different approach, one that would bind Arabia's scattered tribes together through bonds stronger than conquest. What followed was perhaps the most brilliant political campaign in Arabian history. Muhammad began reaching out to tribal leaders across the peninsula with marriage proposals that carried deep political significance. When he married Habiba, daughter of Abu Sufyan, he transformed his greatest enemy into a reluctant ally. These weren't simple romantic unions, but calculated moves that created blood ties with powerful families. Each marriage sent a clear message. Islam was no longer an outsider movement, but a force seeking to unite, not destroy, Arabia's traditional structure. The Prophet's diplomatic genius showed most clearly in his approach to the Bedouin tribes. Rather than demanding immediate conversion, he offered protection and trade partnerships. Tribal delegations began arriving in Medina, curious about this new power that combined military strength with unexpected generosity. Muhammad would meet these envoys personally, often surprising them with his knowledge of their customs and genealogies. The breakthrough came with the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in 628 CE. Though many Muslims initially saw it as a defeat, they were prevented from making pilgrimage to Mecca. Muhammad understood its true value. The 10-year truce legitimized his authority and allowed peaceful interaction between Muslims and Meccan merchants. Trade resumed, and with it came countless opportunities for conversation and conversion. During these peaceful interludes, Islam spread in ways that armies never could have achieved. Merchants carried the faith along trade routes. Poets composed verses about Muhammad's character, spreading his reputation to distant oases. Women who had married into Muslim families quietly influenced their relatives. The faith began taking root in hearts rather than being imposed by force. The conversion of key tribal chiefs created a domino effect. When Khalid ibn Walid, known as Sayf Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of Allah, embraced Islam, he brought tactical expertise and tribal loyalty that would prove invaluable. Similar conversions among influential leaders provided Muhammad with a network of allies stretching across the peninsula. By 630 CE, this patient diplomatic campaign had transformed the political landscape. When Muhammad finally returned to Mecca with 10,000 followers, the city surrendered without bloodshed. The sight of former enemies walking alongside devoted Muslims demonstrated Islam's power to transcend old tribal divisions. The network of marriages, treaties, and conversions had created something unprecedented in Arabian history. a confederation bound by shared faith rather than mere tribal loyalty. These alliances would soon enable the explosive expansion that would carry Islam beyond Arabia's borders, forever changing the course of world history. Chapter 3: Triumph and Turmoil, Confrontation, Conquest, and Consolidation. Part 1: Watershed Battles, Badr, Uhud, and the Trench. The sands near Badr witnessed something extraordinary in 624 CE. Muhammad and his 300 followers faced nearly 1,000 Meccan warriors led by Abu Jahl, their most bitter enemy. The Muslims had little armor, few horses, and even fewer weapons. Most carried simple swords and wooden shields. Yet when the dust settled, Abu Jahl lay dead, and the mighty Meccan army fled in panic. The victory shocked everyone, including the Muslims themselves. They had captured 70 prisoners and seized valuable weapons and camels. More importantly, they proved that this new faith could defend itself. Word spread across Arabia that the followers of Muhammad were no longer helpless refugees. Young men began joining their ranks, and hostile tribes reconsidered their plans to attack Medina. But triumph bred overconfidence. The next year at Uhud, the same Meccan forces returned with 3,000 warriors. This time, Muslim archers abandoned their posts too early, chasing after spoils of war. The disciplined Meccan cavalry wheeled around and struck hard. Muhammad himself was wounded, blood streaming down his face as rumors spread that he had died. The Muslims retreated up the mountain, their earlier confidence shattered. The defeat taught harsh lessons about discipline and unity. Some newer converts began questioning whether God truly favored Muhammad. The prophet spent months rebuilding morale, emphasizing that setbacks were tests of faith. He restructured his forces and insisted that victory required both divine blessing and human preparation. The Meccans returned in 627 with their largest army yet, 10,000 men from multiple tribes. This time, Muhammad chose a brilliant defensive strategy. His followers dug a massive trench around Medina's vulnerable northern approach, something Arabia had never seen before. The Meccan cavalry, their greatest advantage, became useless against this barrier. For weeks, the siege dragged on. The attackers grew frustrated and hungry, while the defenders remained safely behind their walls and trench. Cold winds and sandstorms made camp life miserable for the besiegers. Internal tensions arose between different tribal groups in the Meccan alliance. Some began questioning whether conquering Medina was worth such hardship. Then came the breakthrough. Through careful diplomacy and intelligence work, Muhammad's followers sowed distrust between the Meccans and their Jewish allies within Medina. Suspicions grew on both sides until the alliance crumbled. One stormy night, the entire Meccan army simply packed up and left. These 3 battles transformed everything. The Muslims evolved from desperate refugees into a formidable military force. Their enemies learned that attacking Medina carried serious risks, while potential allies saw opportunity in joining the growing movement. The psychological impact proved even more significant than the military outcomes. Islam had survived its greatest tests and emerged stronger than before. Part 2: The Fate of Opponents, Alliances, Betrayals, and the Fall of Rivals. Victory on the battlefield meant little if enemies remained within the city walls. Muhammad now faced his most delicate challenge yet, dealing with the Jewish tribes who had called Medina home long before his arrival. These communities possessed wealth, weapons, and deep knowledge of local politics. Some had initially welcomed the Muslim refugees, seeing potential allies against their Arab rivals. Others watched with growing alarm as Muhammad's influence expanded. The Banu Qaynuqa tribe controlled much of Medina's goldsmith trade. Their workshops produced the finest jewelry and weapons in the region. When tensions erupted over a marketplace incident involving a Muslim woman, Muhammad demanded they convert or face consequences. The tribe retreated to their fortified quarter, confident their wealth and connections would protect them. They were wrong. After a brief siege, they agreed to leave Medina entirely, abandoning their shops and homes. Their departure sent shockwaves through the remaining Jewish communities. The Banu Nadir tribe learned this lesson too late. Accusations flew that they had plotted to assassinate Muhammad during a diplomatic meeting. Whether true or fabricated, these charges provided the justification needed. Muhammad's forces surrounded their date palm groves and strongholds. The tribe's leaders calculated their options carefully. Unlike the Kainuka, they negotiated better terms, keeping their portable wealth while abandoning their lands. Caravans of camels carried away generations of accumulated treasures as they headed north toward Khaybar. The most dramatic confrontation came with the Banu Qurayza. These were the allies suspected of betraying the Muslim cause during the Battle of the Trench. When the siege ended and Meccan forces withdrew, attention turned immediately to settling scores. Muhammad appointed Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, a former ally of the tribe, as judge. Sa'd, wounded during the recent battle and dying, pronounced a harsh verdict following traditional Arab law. The tribe's men faced execution while women and children became captives. This decision shocked even some Muslims, but it accomplished multiple objectives. It eliminated a potential fifth column within Medina while demonstrating the cost of betrayal. The tribe's fertile lands passed to Muhammad's followers, strengthening their economic position. Most importantly, it established clear rules about loyalty and consequences that other communities could not ignore. Arab tribes throughout the region took careful note of these developments. Some chieftains who had hesitated now sent delegations offering submission. Others reinforced their defenses and strengthened existing alliances. The transformation was remarkable. Medina evolved from a divided city harboring multiple competing groups into a unified base of operations under single leadership. The psychological impact extended far beyond Medina's boundaries. Muhammad had proven he could be both merciful and ruthless depending on circumstances. Former enemies learned that accommodation offered better prospects than resistance, while wavering allies understood the importance of demonstrating unwavering loyalty. These harsh lessons in statecraft would soon facilitate even greater conquests. Part 3. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Peace or strategic pause? As Muhammad's influence spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula, his followers expected him to march directly on Mecca and reclaim the sacred Kaaba. Instead, he surprised everyone with a different approach. In 628 CE, 6 years after fleeing Mecca, Muhammad announced his intention to perform the pilgrimage to the holy city, not as a conqueror, but as a peaceful worshipper. The Meccan leadership panicked. They could not allow their former enemy to enter their city, even for religious purposes. When Muhammad approached with 1,400 followers, armed only for protection during travel, the Quraysh sent negotiators to meet them at a place called Hudaybiyah, just outside Mecca's boundaries. What followed became one of history's most controversial peace agreements. The treaty terms seemed to heavily favor the Meccans. Muslims would return home without performing pilgrimage that year. They could only visit Mecca the following year, staying just 3 days. Any Meccan who joined Muhammad without family permission had to be returned immediately. However, Muslims who defected to Mecca could stay there freely. Muhammad's own followers felt betrayed. How could their leader accept such humiliating conditions? Some questioned his judgment openly. The great warrior Umar ibn al-Khattab voiced what many thought. This felt like surrender, not victory. The atmosphere grew tense as disappointed Muslims struggled to understand their leader's decision. But Muhammad saw what others missed. This treaty achieved something military conquest could not: legitimacy. For the first time, the Quraysh recognized him as an equal negotiating partner, not just a rebel troublemaker. The agreement established a 10-year truce, creating stability that would prove invaluable. The immediate results exceeded all expectations. Without constant warfare draining resources and attention, Muhammad could focus on expanding his influence among other Arab tribes. Delegations arrived regularly in Medina, seeking alliances and converting to Islam. The religion spread faster during this peaceful period than during years of fighting. More importantly, the treaty allowed interaction between Muslims and Meccans for the first time in years. Ordinary Meccans could now observe Muslim behavior directly, seeing their former enemies as disciplined, united people rather than dangerous rebels. Many began secretly considering conversion. The following year, when Muslims finally performed their delayed pilgrimage, they entered Mecca as promised, but as respected visitors, not conquered subjects. The sight of 2,000 disciplined Muslims performing their religious duties impressed many Meccans. Some leading families quietly began negotiations for conversion. Within 2 years, the treaty's wisdom became clear. When a minor incident provided justification, Muhammad had built such overwhelming support that Mecca surrendered without significant resistance. The patient diplomat had achieved what the warrior alone never could, a transformation of hearts and minds that made conquest inevitable and welcomed. Part 4, The Unstoppable March, Conquest of Mecca, 630 CE. The morning of Ramadan 8th, 630 CE brought news that would change everything. A Muslim ally had been attacked, breaking the Hudaybiyah Treaty. Muhammad now had his justification, but more importantly, he had something unprecedented, an army of 10,000 men marching toward Mecca. Word spread through the desert faster than the advancing Muslim columns. This was no raiding party or desperate gamble. The man who had fled Mecca 8 years earlier as a hunted refugee was returning with a force larger than any the Arabian Peninsula had ever seen. Tribal leaders who had remained neutral suddenly found themselves making urgent decisions about their future. Abu Sufyan, the Meccan leader who had opposed Muhammad for decades, rode out to meet the advancing army. What he saw must have shaken him to his core. These weren't the scattered bands he had fought before. Column after column of disciplined fighters stretched across the horizon, their banners snapping in the desert wind. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Resistance would mean the total destruction of his city. Muhammad received his former enemy with surprising dignity. Rather than humiliation or demands for revenge, he offered something Abu Sufyan never expected: safety for anyone who remained in their homes, took refuge in the Kaaba, or entered Abu Sufyan's own house. The Meccan leader, faced with overwhelming force and unexpected mercy, made the only choice that made sense. He accepted Islam on the spot. The army approached Mecca from 4 directions, but this was conquest by design, not massacre. Muhammad had given strict orders: no fighting unless attacked, no pursuing those who fled, no entering homes uninvited. As the Muslim forces flowed into the city like a controlled flood, most Meccans simply watched from their doorways, stunned by the discipline of their conquerors. The moment that mattered most came at the Kaaba itself. Muhammad walked slowly around the ancient shrine, touching his staff to each of the 360 idols that had dominated Meccan religion for generations. One by one, they toppled to the ground. With each fallen statue, a collective gasp rose from the watching crowd. This wasn't just military conquest, it was spiritual revolution happening before their eyes. Standing before the assembled Meccans, Muhammad could have demanded anything. These were the people who had persecuted his followers, driven him into exile, and waged war against his message for years. Instead, he asked a simple question: how do you think I will treat you? When they pleaded for mercy, he gave them words that would echo through history: go, you are free. The mass conversions that followed weren't forced, they were inevitable. Faced with such unexpected mercy from a position of absolute power, resistance crumbled. Family after family, clan after clan, stepped forward to embrace Islam. The city that had been the heart of Arabian paganism became, in a single day, the spiritual center of a new faith. This wasn't just about one city changing hands. Muhammad had demonstrated that power without revenge was possible, that conquest could lead to forgiveness rather than destruction. The message spread across Arabia with unprecedented speed. This was a leader worth following, a faith worth joining. Part 5. Unification and Farewell. Last Pilgrimage and Muhammad's Death. By 632 CE, Muhammad stood at the peak of his influence. The once fractured Arabian Peninsula had largely united under Islam's banner. Tribes that had warred for generations now prayed together, traded peacefully, and recognized one leader. Yet Muhammad sensed his time was drawing to a close. In March 632, he announced his intention to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. This wasn't unusual. Muslims were expected to make this journey. But something felt different. Muhammad spoke with unusual urgency about the importance of this particular trip. Over 100,000 followers joined him, creating the largest gathering in Arabian history. The pilgrimage itself became a masterclass in Islamic principles. Muhammad performed each ritual with deliberate care, knowing countless eyes watched his every move. These actions would become the template for future generations. At the plain of Arafat, he delivered what many sensed would be his final major address. His words carried the weight of finality. He spoke of human equality. Arab and non-Arab, black and white, rich and poor, all equal before God. He emphasized justice, fair treatment of women, and the sanctity of life and property. Most powerfully, he asked the massive crowd, "Have I conveyed the message?" The thunderous response of "Yes" echoed across the desert. Muhammad raised his hands and declared, "O God, bear witness." The return journey to Medina was somber. Muhammad fell ill with fever and severe headaches. For days, he struggled to lead prayers, eventually asking Abu Bakr, his closest companion, to take his place. The community watched anxiously as their leader weakened. On June 8, 632, Muhammad died in the arms of his wife Aisha. The news struck like lightning. Many refused to believe it. Omar, one of his most devoted followers, drew his sword and threatened anyone who claimed the Prophet was dead. The community teetered on the edge of chaos. Abu Bakr's calm words saved the moment. "Whoever worshipped Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead," he said. "Whoever worshipped God, know that God is alive and never dies." He recited verses from the Quran reminding everyone that Muhammad was mortal, a messenger, not divine himself. The immediate question became, who would lead? Muhammad had left no clear successor, no detailed instructions for governance. The community faced its first major crisis. Some believed Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, should lead. Others supported Abu Bakr's experience and close relationship with the Prophet. Urgent meetings filled with heated debates determined the path forward. Eventually, Abu Bakr emerged as the first caliph, the successor, but the cracks were already showing. The unity Muhammad had forged through personality and divine authority now rested on human politics and competing interpretations of his legacy. The young Muslim state stood at a crossroads. Would it fragment back into tribal divisions, or would it find new ways to maintain the unity their prophet had created? The answer would reshape not just Arabia, but the entire known world. Chapter 4: The Fire Spreads, Caliphs, Conquests, and the Islamic Empire. Part 1: Crisis and Consensus, Abu Bakr and the Wars of Apostasy. The Prophet's breath had barely stilled when the Muslim community faced its first existential crisis. Muhammad's death in 632 CE left a gaping void that threatened to tear apart everything he had built. Without a clear successor, the tribes that had recently sworn allegiance to Islam began to waver. Some openly questioned whether their oaths died with the Prophet himself. In Medina's scorching heat, tribal leaders gathered in heated debate. The Ansar, Muhammad's earliest supporters, believed leadership should remain with them. The Muhajirun, those who had followed Muhammad from Mecca, argued otherwise. Voices rose, tempers flared, and the very foundation of the young faith trembled. Then Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest companion and father-in-law, stepped forward with words that would echo through history. Abu Bakr was not the obvious choice. Omar ibn al-Khattab possessed greater physical strength. Ali ibn Abi Talib had closer blood ties to the Prophet. Yet Abu Bakr's gentle wisdom and unwavering faith had earned him a special place in Muhammad's inner circle. When he spoke, people listened. His voice carried the weight of someone who had stood beside the Prophet through triumph and trial. The decision came swiftly. Abu Bakr became the first caliph, meaning successor. But accepting the title proved easier than wielding its power. Across the Arabian Peninsula, news of Muhammad's death sparked rebellion. Entire tribes declared their independence from Medina's authority. They reasoned their contracts had been with Muhammad personally, not with his successors or his faith. The situation grew desperate. Musaylama, a rival prophet in the Najd region, gathered thousands of followers who believed his revelations rivaled Muhammad's Quran. Tulayha ibn Khuwaylid rallied the Asad tribe under his own prophetic claims. In Yemen, Aswad al-Ansi had already established a separate kingdom before Muhammad's death. These weren't mere political rebellions, but direct challenges to Islam's spiritual authority. Abu Bakr faced a terrible choice. He could let the tribes go and preserve what remained, or fight to maintain the unity Muhammad had forged. The risk was enormous. Military campaigns would drain resources and potentially destroy the fragile Muslim state. Yet Abu Bakr understood that yielding now would signal weakness and invite further fragmentation. The Ridda Wars began with brutal efficiency. Abu Bakr deployed his most capable general, Khalid ibn al-Walid, known as Sayf Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of God. Khalid's reputation preceded him like wildfire. Tribes that might have resisted other commanders sometimes surrendered at the mere mention of his name. The battles were swift but merciless. At Ulais, Khalid's forces crushed Musailima's confederation. The false prophet himself fell in combat, his dreams of rivalry ending in blood-soaked sand. One by one, rebellious tribes submitted or faced annihilation. Abu Bakr showed no mercy to those who had abandoned their faith, viewing apostasy as the ultimate betrayal. Within 2 years, Arabian unity was restored. But Abu Bakr had achieved something greater than military victory. He had established the principle that Islamic leadership transcended tribal loyalties. The caliphate became both a political institution and a religious authority, setting the stage for expansion beyond Arabia's borders. This consolidation would prove crucial. The disciplined armies that had crushed internal rebellion now looked outward toward the vast empires of Byzantium and Persia, their confidence unshakable and their unity complete. Part 2. The Twin Giants Fall. Byzantine and Sassanid empires overthrown. The unified Arabian armies that had crushed rebellion at home set their sights on targets that seemed impossible. The Byzantine and Persian empires. These were not mere kingdoms, but ancient superpowers that had dominated the region for centuries. The Byzantines controlled vast territories from Constantinople to Damascus, while the Sassanid Persians ruled from Iraq to India. Both empires commanded professional armies, fortified cities, and treasuries filled with gold. Yet both giants were bleeding from decades of warfare against each other. The Byzantine-Persian conflicts had drained their resources and exhausted their populations. Cities lay in ruins, farmlands had been ravaged, and neither empire could field the massive armies they once commanded. Their soldiers were weary, their people overtaxed, and their leaders struggled to maintain control over restless provinces. The Muslim commanders recognized this opportunity with remarkable clarity. Khalid ibn al-Walid, known as the Sword of God, emerged as the most brilliant military mind of his generation. He understood that speed and mobility could defeat larger, slower enemies. His cavalry units moved like lightning across the desert, striking where enemies least expected and vanishing before reinforcements arrived. Religious motivation fueled these campaigns in ways the old empires could not match. Muslim soldiers believed they fought for paradise itself, making them fearless in battle. They saw their victories as proof of divine favor, while their enemies struggled with divided loyalties and competing interests. Local populations, oppressed by heavy taxes and religious persecution, often welcomed the Muslim armies as liberators. The Byzantine provinces of Syria and Palestine fell first. Damascus surrendered in 634, followed by Jerusalem in 637. The Sassanid heartland proved equally vulnerable. Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, fell in 637, and the last Sassanid emperor fled eastward as his empire crumbled around him. What made these conquests extraordinary was not just their speed, but their permanence. Unlike typical raiders who pillaged and departed, the Muslim armies established lasting administration. They offered defeated populations a choice: convert to Islam, accept protected status, and pay tribute, or face the sword. Most chose the middle path, finding Muslim rule more tolerant than what they had known under their former masters. Within a generation, 2 empires that had shaped civilization for 1,000 years had vanished. The Mediterranean world that had been Roman and Christian for centuries now answered to Arabic-speaking Muslim rulers. The Persian lands that had preserved Zoroastrian traditions since antiquity adopted new laws and customs. These victories transformed the Muslim community from a regional Arabian force into a world-spanning empire. The wealth seized from conquered territories funded further expansion, while the experience gained in governing diverse populations prepared Muslim leaders for even greater challenges ahead. Part 3. Turning the Tide. Battles of Yarmouk and Qadisiyah. The victories came down to 2 earth-shaking battles that changed everything. While Muslim armies swept across the former empires, 2 specific clashes would forever alter the course of history. These weren't just military engagements, they were moments when the fate of entire civilizations hung in the balance. At Yarmouk in 636 CE, Khalid ibn al-Walid faced the massive Byzantine army in the Jordan Valley. The Byzantines had assembled their finest troops, convinced they could crush the Arab threat once and for all. Emperor Heraclius himself had overseen the preparations, pouring resources into what he believed would be the decisive campaign. The Muslim force seemed vastly outnumbered, but Khalid had earned his nickname Saif Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of God, for good reason. The battle began with the Byzantines confident in their superior numbers and heavy armor. Their cavalry charged repeatedly, expecting to break the Arab lines as they had done against so many enemies before. But Khalid had positioned his forces brilliantly, using the terrain to his advantage. When the moment came, he executed a perfect pincer movement, surrounding the Byzantine army in what became known as one of history's greatest tactical masterpieces. The slaughter was complete. Thousands of Byzantine soldiers perished, and with them died Byzantine control over Syria and Palestine. The survivors fled northward, carrying news of catastrophic defeat back to Constantinople. The emperor who had once reclaimed Jerusalem from the Persians now watched helplessly as his greatest provinces slipped away forever. Meanwhile, at Qadisiyah in 637 CE, another drama unfolded against the Sassanid Empire. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas led the Muslim forces against Rustam, the greatest Persian general of his age. The Persian army arrived with war elephants, elite cavalry, and the confidence of a 1,000-year-old empire. Their banners gleamed with silk and gold, symbols of wealth and power that had intimidated enemies for generations. But the Arabs fought with something the Persians couldn't understand: absolute certainty in their cause. When the Persian elephants charged, the Muslim warriors held firm, using their spears and arrows to turn the massive beasts back onto their own forces. The battle raged for days, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage until a sandstorm struck the field. The storm blew directly into Persian faces, while the Muslims fought with the wind at their backs. In that moment of chaos, Sa'd ordered the final assault. Rustam himself fell in the fighting, his royal standard captured. The Sassanid army collapsed, and with it, the empire that had ruled Persia since the time of Christ. These victories weren't just military triumphs. They were psychological earthquakes. News of Yarmouk and Qadisiyah spread like wildfire across both empires, convincing many that resistance was futile. Entire cities opened their gates rather than face the armies that had destroyed such mighty forces. The wealth captured funded new campaigns, while the prestige attracted new converts and allies to the Muslim cause. Part 4. Integration or distinction. New laws, protected peoples, and social change. Victory brought new challenges no one had expected. As Muslim armies swept across former Byzantine and Persian territories, commanders faced an immediate problem. How do you rule millions of people who don't share your faith? The old empires had collapsed, but their diverse populations remained. Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and dozens of other groups who had lived under imperial rule for centuries. The early caliphs made a brilliant decision that would shape Islamic civilization for 1,000 years. Rather than forcing conversion or expelling non-Muslims, they created the dhimmi system, a revolutionary approach to religious minorities. Christians and Jews received special protection as people of the book, while other groups like Zoroastrians gradually gained similar status. These communities could keep their churches, synagogues, and temples. They could practice their faiths, govern their internal affairs, and conduct business freely. The price for this protection was the jizya tax, paid by adult males who weren't Muslim. Many complained about this burden, but pragmatic leaders quickly realized something surprising. Life under Muslim rule often proved better than what they'd known before. Byzantine tax collectors had been notoriously harsh, while Persian nobles had treated common people like property. The new rulers, bound by Islamic law to protect their dhimmi subjects, often proved more just than their predecessors. Social hierarchies emerged naturally from these arrangements. Muslims occupied the top tier, enjoying full political rights and paying only religious taxes like zakat. Below them, dhimmis formed a protected middle class, excluded from military service and certain government positions, but free to prosper in trade, crafts, and scholarship. At the bottom remained slaves, though Islamic law encouraged their eventual freedom through various means. These changes created unexpected cultural flowering. Damascus, once a Byzantine stronghold, became a cosmopolitan center where Muslim merchants worked alongside Christian bankers and Jewish scholars. In conquered Persian cities, Zoroastrian engineers helped build irrigation systems, while Muslim administrators learned sophisticated accounting methods. Knowledge flowed freely between communities, laying groundwork for later Islamic achievements in science and philosophy. Yet tensions simmered beneath this apparent harmony. Some Muslims worried about losing their distinct identity among so many non-believers. Religious scholars debated whether too much mixing would weaken Islamic faith. Meanwhile, some Christians and Jews chafed under dhimmi restrictions, particularly educated elites who found themselves excluded from high government positions they'd once held. Local commanders handled these challenges differently, creating a patchwork of policies across the expanding empire. Some regions saw remarkable cooperation between communities, while others experienced periodic friction. The speed of conquest had outpaced the development of consistent administrative systems, leaving individual governors to improvise solutions. This religious and social experiment would soon face its greatest test. As wealth and power concentrated in Muslim hands, questions arose about who truly deserved to lead this diverse empire. The unity forged in conquest was about to fracture over the most fundamental question of all: succession. Part 5. Division in the Ranks, Seeds of Sectarianism. The assassination of Umar ibn al-Khattab in 644 CE shattered the early Muslim community's sense of divine protection. A Persian slave named Abu Lulu struck down the second caliph during morning prayers, plunging a dagger into his back. As Umar lay dying, he appointed a council of 6 men to choose his successor. This decision would prove fateful. The council selected Uthman ibn Affan, a wealthy merchant from the powerful Umayyad clan. Many Muslims welcomed this choice, but others whispered that Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, deserved the position. Ali had married Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, and his supporters believed blood ties and early devotion should matter more than tribal politics. Uthman's 12-year reign began peacefully, but grew increasingly controversial. He appointed his relatives to key positions across the empire, replacing seasoned commanders with Umayyad family members. Critics accused him of nepotism and favoritism. More troubling still, Uthman ordered the compilation of a single official version of the Quran, destroying all other variants. This practical decision sparked outrage among those who cherished their local versions of the holy text. Provincial governors grew wealthy, while common soldiers struggled. Egypt, Iraq, and other regions sent delegations to Medina, demanding Uthman's removal. The aging caliph, now in his 80s, seemed unable to control the mounting crisis. Rebels from Egypt marched on the capital in 656 CE, surrounding Uthman's house. During a tense siege, the rebels stormed the residence and killed Uthman while he read the Quran. His blood supposedly stained the pages he was reading. The sight of their murdered leader's bloodied Quran became a rallying symbol for his supporters, who demanded justice for his death. Ali finally became the 4th caliph, but his triumph was hollow. Aisha, Muhammad's widow, accused him of failing to pursue Uthman's killers with enough vigor. She joined 2 prominent companions, Talha and Zubair, in raising an army against Ali. The resulting Battle of the Camel in 656 CE saw Muslims killing Muslims for the first time since Muhammad's death. Meanwhile, Muawiyah, Uthman's cousin and governor of Syria, refused to recognize Ali's authority. He displayed Uthman's bloodied shirt in Damascus's main mosque, swearing vengeance. When Ali and Muawiyah's armies met at Siffin in 657 CE, the battle ended in arbitration rather than decisive victory. Many of Ali's supporters felt betrayed by this compromise and abandoned him, forming a radical group called the Kharijites. The Kharijites believed that any righteous Muslim could lead the community, regardless of tribal affiliation or family connections. They viewed both Ali and Muawiyah as corrupt and unworthy. In 661 CE, a Kharijite assassin struck down Ali while he prayed in Kufa's mosque. These bloody conflicts fractured the Muslim community permanently. Those who supported Ali's family's right to rule became known as Shia, meaning partisans. They believed leadership should pass through Muhammad's bloodline via Ali and Fatima. The majority, later called Sunni, accepted that the community could choose its leaders through consultation and consensus. The seeds of this division would grow into centuries of theological, political, and military conflict that continues today. Chapter 5. Light and Shadow, the Global Legacy of Islamic Expansion. Part 1. The Age of Learning, Science, trade, and the Islamic Golden Age. The Islamic Empire's rapid expansion created something extraordinary that few conquerors in history had achieved. Within decades of establishing control across vast territories, Muslim rulers began fostering an intellectual revolution that would reshape human knowledge forever. Baghdad emerged as the crown jewel of this transformation. The Abbasid caliphs poured enormous resources into creating the House of Wisdom, where scholars from every corner of the known world gathered. Christians, Jews, Muslims, and followers of ancient Persian traditions worked side by side, translating Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian astronomy into Arabic. These weren't just copying exercises. The scholars improved upon everything they touched. Al-Khwarizmi revolutionized mathematics by developing algebra, giving the world a new way to solve complex problems. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote medical texts so advanced that European universities would use them for centuries. Al-Razi conducted experiments that laid foundations for modern chemistry. These men weren't working in isolation. They built upon each other's discoveries, creating a network of knowledge that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. Trade networks followed the same pattern of explosive growth. Muslim merchants established routes that connected 3 continents. Caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious metals traveled safely under Islamic protection. The same legal systems and currencies worked from Morocco to India, making commerce smoother than ever before. Cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba became cosmopolitan centers where people speaking dozens of languages conducted business daily. The wealth from trade funded more learning. Libraries in Cordoba held over 400,000 books when most European cities barely had a few hundred. Scholars in Cairo studied anatomy by dissecting corpses while their European counterparts relied on ancient texts. In Samarkand, astronomers built instruments so precise they could track planetary movements with stunning accuracy. This wasn't just about preserving old knowledge. Islamic scholars made breakthrough discoveries that European thinkers wouldn't match for centuries. They understood that the Earth was round and calculated its circumference. They performed cataract surgery and developed treatments for smallpox. They created mechanical clocks and improved agricultural techniques that fed growing populations. The cultural mixing produced remarkable results. Persian poetry merged with Arab literary traditions. Byzantine architectural techniques combined with Islamic geometric patterns to create stunning mosques and palaces. Music, art, and crafts flourished as different traditions learned from each other. Yet this golden age carried seeds of future challenges. The very diversity that sparked innovation also created tensions. Different regions developed distinct identities. Local rulers began asserting independence from distant caliphs. The wealth that funded learning also attracted corruption and power struggles. As the Islamic world reached its intellectual peak, the forces that would eventually fragment this remarkable civilization were already gathering strength. The question became whether this empire of knowledge could maintain its unity in the face of growing internal pressures. Part 2. Interfaith relations, tolerance, conversion, and protected minorities. The Golden Age brought Muslim rulers face to face with a practical challenge that would define Islamic civilization for centuries. How do you govern millions of people who worship different gods, speak different languages, and follow different customs? The answer came through a system that was revolutionary for its time. Christians and Jews became people of the book, protected minorities who could keep their faith in exchange for special taxes called jizya. This wasn't simple tolerance. It was a calculated arrangement that kept conquered populations stable while filling the empire's treasury. In Spain, this system created something remarkable. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked side by side in Cordoba's libraries. Christian merchants sold goods in Damascus markets. Jewish doctors treated Muslim patients in Baghdad hospitals. The daily reality often defied religious boundaries as neighbors helped neighbors, regardless of faith. Yet beneath this cooperation lay constant tension. The jizya tax marked non-Muslims as different, sometimes forcing families into poverty. While conversion to Islam wasn't officially forced, the practical benefits were obvious. Muslims paid lower taxes, could serve in government, and faced fewer restrictions. Over generations, these pressures pushed millions toward Islam. The experience varied dramatically by location and ruler. In Persia, Zoroastrians found their ancient temples protected, but their political power stripped away. In Egypt, Coptic Christians initially welcomed Muslim rule as liberation from Byzantine oppression, only to watch their influence slowly diminish as Arabic replaced their language and Islam became the path to advancement. Some rulers embraced diversity as strength. They appointed Christian advisors, commissioned Jewish translators, and celebrated Persian festivals. Others saw non-Muslims as potential threats, restricting their movements and limiting their rights. A single change of leadership could transform a thriving minority community into a persecuted group almost overnight. The most profound changes happened gradually. Children grew up hearing Arabic prayers 5 times daily. Muslim festivals became civic celebrations. Islamic law shaped marriage, business, and inheritance customs. Even families who kept their ancestral faith found themselves living in an increasingly Muslim world. Conversion stories reveal the complexity. Some embraced Islam through genuine spiritual conviction. Others converted for marriage, career advancement, or social acceptance. Many lived as cultural Muslims while privately maintaining older beliefs. The boundaries between voluntary and pressured conversion often blurred beyond recognition. These interfaith dynamics created the Islamic world's greatest strength and its deepest vulnerability. The diversity that sparked innovation also planted seeds of division. Protected minorities preserved valuable knowledge, but sometimes resented their subordinate status. The promise of tolerance attracted converts, but also created communities with divided loyalties. By the 10th century, this delicate balance was beginning to shift. External pressures from Crusaders and Mongols would test these interfaith relationships like never before. The question became whether the bonds forged during the Golden Age could survive when the empire itself came under attack. Part 3. The Human Cost: Conquest, Conflict, and Displacement. When the dust settled on conquered territories, the true price of Islamic expansion became clear. Behind every victory lay broken lives, scattered families, and communities torn apart by war. The human cost of building an empire stretched far beyond the battlefields. The armies that brought Islam to new lands left destruction in their wake. Cities that resisted faced brutal sieges. Damascus surrendered quickly and suffered little damage. But towns that fought back paid heavily. Walls crumbled under assault, buildings burned, markets that once bustled with life stood empty and silent. Families faced impossible choices during these conquests. Many fled their homes with nothing but the clothes they wore. They walked for days through hostile territory, hoping to reach safety in distant lands. Others stayed and watched their world change forever. Children who had played in familiar streets suddenly found themselves under foreign rule. The treatment of prisoners sparked controversy even among Muslim commanders. Some leaders showed mercy to defeated enemies. Others were harsh beyond necessity. Stories spread of mass executions and brutal punishments. These accounts created lasting resentment among conquered peoples who passed down tales of suffering through generations. Women and children bore much of the war's burden. When armies clashed, families scattered. Mothers searched desperately for lost children. Wives became widows overnight. The slave markets in Damascus and Baghdad filled with captives torn from their homelands. These human tragedies rarely found their way into official histories written by the victors. Local populations developed various forms of resistance. Some fought openly with weapons and guerrilla tactics. Others used passive resistance, refusing to cooperate with new administrators. Cultural rebellion flourished as people clung to old customs and languages. These acts of defiance showed that conquest meant control of territory, not hearts and minds. The economic disruption proved as devastating as physical violence. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries collapsed overnight. Farmers abandoned their fields when armies passed through. Craftsmen lost their workshops and tools. Entire regions faced famine when war destroyed harvest seasons. Even successful military leaders struggled with the moral weight of their actions. Some commanders expressed doubt about the price of expansion. Letters between generals reveal concerns about civilian casualties and excessive force. These private admissions showed that even warriors recognized the heavy cost of empire building. The conquered populations created their own narratives of these events. Persian, Byzantine, and North African sources tell different stories than Arab chronicles. These accounts preserve memories of suffering and loss that official histories often ignored. They remind us that every conquest had victims whose voices deserve to be heard. As the Islamic Empire consolidated its gains, administrators had to manage the aftermath of violent expansion. Rebuilding trust with traumatized populations became essential for long-term stability. The challenge of governing reluctant subjects would test the empire's ability to transform military conquest into lasting political control. Part 4. Decay and Decline: Corruption, Division, and Foreign Domination. The Grand Islamic Empire that once stretched from Spain to India began showing cracks within just a few generations of Muhammad's death. The very success that had built the empire started working against it. Vast territories became impossible to govern effectively from a single center. Distance and poor communication meant local governors often acted like independent rulers, caring more about their own wealth than the broader empire. Power struggles tore apart the unity that had made early expansion possible. Different branches of Muhammad's family claimed rightful leadership, splitting Muslims into competing factions. The Umayyads in Damascus faced constant challenges from other claimants, while the later Abbasids in Baghdad struggled with their own internal revolts. Each change of dynasty brought civil wars that drained resources and weakened central authority. Corruption became a cancer eating away at the empire's foundations. Officials who had once lived simply now surrounded themselves with luxury. Tax collectors kept more for themselves and sent less to the central treasury. Military commanders sold positions to the highest bidders rather than promoting based on merit. The religious ideals that had inspired the first Muslim armies seemed forgotten as leaders focused on personal gain. The army itself reflected these problems. Early Muslim forces had been disciplined believers fighting for a cause they understood. Later armies relied heavily on foreign mercenaries who fought only for pay. These soldiers had no loyalty to Islamic principles or the empire's mission. When payments stopped coming regularly, they sometimes turned against their employers or simply deserted. Economic troubles multiplied these political failures. Trade routes that had enriched the empire faced new competition as other powers developed alternative paths. Heavy taxation to fund endless wars drove many productive citizens into poverty or rebellion. Agricultural regions suffered from neglect as administrators focused on extracting wealth rather than maintaining the systems that created it. Religious authority fragmented along with political power. Different regions developed their own interpretations of Islamic law and practice. Scholars who had once worked together to develop unified legal systems now served competing rulers with conflicting interests. The spiritual unity that had bound diverse populations together began dissolving into sectarian divisions. External enemies sensed this weakness and struck accordingly. Christian kingdoms in Spain launched their reconquest campaigns. Byzantine forces pushed back against Muslim territories they had lost centuries earlier. New powers like the Mongols swept in from the east, finding divided Muslim armies unable to coordinate effective resistance. The once mighty Islamic Empire had become a collection of squabbling kingdoms, each jealously guarding its own interests, while foreign powers picked off territories one by one. The transformation from unified expansion to chaotic decline revealed how quickly historical momentum can shift when internal cohesion breaks down. Part 5. Lasting Imprints: Islam's Place in Modern Memory. The collapse of unified Islamic power did not erase the profound marks left by those early centuries of expansion. Today, over 1,400 years later, the echoes of Muhammad's movement continue to shape how people understand their place in the world. The story of Islam's birth has become far more than historical record. It lives as a powerful force in modern identity and politics. Walk through any major city from Morocco to Indonesia, and you witness this living legacy. The call to prayer still sounds 5 times daily over urban landscapes where skyscrapers rise beside ancient mosques. Modern Muslims draw inspiration from those early conquests, seeing in them proof of divine favor and a model for righteous living. The memory of the rapid expansion fuels both spiritual devotion and political ambition across the Islamic world. But these memories spark fierce debates about what the early Islamic story actually means. Conservative voices point to the military victories and territorial gains as evidence that Islam prospers when it follows traditional paths. They see the golden age of learning and conquest as a blueprint for reclaiming lost glory. Progressive Muslims focus instead on the intellectual achievements and cultural synthesis, arguing that Islam's true strength lies in its capacity for adaptation and dialogue. These competing interpretations play out dramatically in contemporary politics. Leaders invoke the early caliphs when justifying everything from social reforms to military campaigns. The memory of Islamic expansion becomes a tool for building national identity in countries from Pakistan to Turkey. Even non-Muslim nations must grapple with this historical legacy as they interact with Islamic societies and understand regional conflicts. The global impact extends beyond the Muslim world itself. The story of Islam's rise shapes how the West views Middle Eastern politics and international relations. Historical grievances about crusades and colonialism interweave with memories of Islamic conquest, creating complex narratives that influence modern diplomacy. Understanding these formative centuries becomes essential for anyone seeking to comprehend contemporary global dynamics. Perhaps most significantly, the early Islamic experience offers lessons about how religious movements transform into political powers. The rapid transition from small prophetic community to vast empire demonstrates both the potential and the perils of religious expansion. Modern observers study this transformation to understand how spiritual authority translates into temporal power, and how success can breed the very divisions that lead to decline. The memory of those crucial early centuries continues to inspire, challenge, and divide people across the globe. Whether viewed as divine triumph or human ambition, the story of Islam's explosive growth remains one of history's most consequential narratives. Its interpretation will likely shape religious, cultural, and political discourse for generations to come, ensuring that Muhammad's 7th century movement retains its power to influence the modern world.